So just really quick, you can leave your camera on, you can leave it off, whatever, whatever you're most comfortable with. But I do want to get a sense of kind of the who's watching this in terms of demographics. So type a 1 in chat if you're an actor, if you could, just so I can get a sense of 1. Oh, a lot of actors, okay. And then type 2 if you're like a sound designer, an engineer, or just anything technical involving sound. No, there's a lot of overlap. And then could you type a 3 if you're just, maybe you're not involved in either of those things, you're just here to observe, just learn something, you saw the description and thought it was cool. Okay. All right, so I'm going to start. And so this is recording voiceover for video games. And if anyone has a question while I'm speaking, go ahead and type that in the chat. I closed the chat. There we go. Yeah, go ahead and just type it in the chat. And I have a screen off to the side here that I'll refer to, and hopefully I'll be able to answer any questions while the presentation's going on. And also, if you have questions at the end, I'll budget time at the end for that. So anyway, yeah, this is recording voiceover for video games. And just so you have a really quick idea of who I am, I'm Tyrone Forte. I've worked in VO for about 9 years. Back in 2011, when I was out of college, Chip and Julia, the founders of Help, had hired me as like a freelancer. And I started as a PA and an assistant, or PA/assistant engineer. And then I eventually transitioned to engineering and editing dialogue for video games. I have a fair number of game titles under my belt since then. And currently I'm freelancing. And I'm also a student because I've been trying to get my master's in software engineering. So that's sort of just a brief overview of who I am. And then so for this webinar, we're just as an overview of the topics, quickly going to mention just the benefits of the webinar for engineers and actors, general description of what VO is like for games, mic techniques, organization of recording session, workflow, working with actors and clients, and then briefly touch on how COVID has affected the industry in remote recording. And then I'll go over some helpful skills in software, and then there'll be a Q&A. Again, definitely ask questions because I had designed this webinar to be a very kind of general, broad overview of VO for video games, but I do recognize some names in here. So I do, if you want me to go into more in depth, just because you see my bullet points and you're like, I already know all this, like what more can you tell me? Feel free to just type in chat, because I do want this to be helpful for everyone and not just things you already know. So the benefits, and again, if you're not involved in sound, or you're not an actor, I still think this talk is beneficial. But specifically, if you're an engineer, I would say it's beneficial to know about VO for video games because video games are such a large and prevalent industry. There's a lot of work to be done, to be hired for as an engineer. And also VO for games is slightly different than TV, movies, and music. And I'll touch on those differences as they come up. And if you're an actor, based on my personal experience, it's really useful when actors sort of know what we're doing on our side of the glass when we're recording, just because if they're more aware, then it helps them help us. I say that in kind of a selfish way, but it does make sessions go very smoothly if the actor, has some knowledge about what we're doing. And then also, because of this new situation with COVID, we've been doing a lot more remote recording. And so the lines between, as an engineer, I try to make it so that actors can just focus on acting. But with remote recording, the line has sort of been blurred, and the actors have had to do a lot more technical setup on their end. So I do think this talk will be beneficial for that purpose, even if this talk is not specifically all about COVID and remote recording. So again, if you've done VO for games, you already know this, but one thing about VO for games is that there's a huge number of lines, and that's because games are just very interactive. For a commercial, or if you're dubbing a TV show, usually you have a specific number of lines based on the narrative. Sometimes you're recording efforts and stuff, but for video games, like, you're recording lines for narrative, of course, but you also have to record like every single type of interaction a player might go through for their character, or even, not even the player character, but for non-playable characters. I've worked on games before that are, highly known and highly regarded for their narrative, and like, the games are almost film-like. But then, like, when I look back at like what work I've actually done on those games, 90% was recording, enemy efforts, or, lines saying like "get down" or "grenade." Also, I would say that VO for games tends to be more dynamic than other fields or other industries. I've done a few commercials, and which is very nice, because when I do commercials, like, I can kind of set my volume to like one level, and it's usually just stays there. Whereas with games, I've been on sessions where we've really quickly gone from, quiet dialogue to shouting and screaming. Directors try to make sure that all that loud stuff is sort of saved towards the end of a session, but sometimes just within a line, characters can just, change the projection. And then just really quick, there's slight differences in mic techniques. There tends to be a lot of technical specifications for games that differ per client. So a lot of times engineers, from game to game, the software they're using, the workflow, it's all just very different based on the game. And then also, I'm not too sure about other industries, to be honest, but I do know for games, like, I would say 99% of the time, I'm using Pro Tools as my audio software. So if you've never seen a VO script before, this is kind of this is a very condensed version. I wouldn't say condensed, but just a very clean version of what a VO script looks like. Oftentimes you'll get a VO script and it'll have a bunch of other columns in here that may be useful for other people in production and might have nothing to do with your, a VO or engineering session. But I just kind of made a mock script that just had sort of the very basics. And so some of the more important things is obviously there are lines. Oftentimes, some of the lines will have a direction that will, give the actor and the director a hint on like what the line should be. And if the client, whoever made the script is really on point, they'll include intensity levels too, which is very, in my opinion, is very important for actor, just for pacing the actor, preserving their voice, because you don't want them to scream a line that turned out to be something that could have been said much more quietly. So a lot of scripts will have intensity levels, and and this comment's more this column B, file names, that's more aimed at engineers and editors. But it's very important for a VO script to have file names, because like I said before, a VO script can have a ton of lines. I've been on sessions where, we've done maybe a 4-hour session that was 200 lines. Usually if it's 200 lines, usually the lines are shorter, but 200 lines nonetheless. And maybe we do that in the morning, the afternoon, it's another 200 lines. So that's 400 lines a day. And if we're working on that project for an entire week, that could be 2,000 lines in 1 week. And so it's really, file names are really useful for an engineer, just to be able to sort all that and to make sure everything's labeled correctly when, recorded and edited files are eventually sent off to the client. And I just point that out because throughout this talk, I am going to mention multiple times how important organization is, for an engineer when doing VO recording. So yeah, for just really briefly again about the VO script, a lot of times, the engineer is controlling that script for you. If you're an actor, sometimes you have a second screen, and the person who's actually showing you things, who's in charge of it is the engineer. So, keep in mind that sometimes if the engineer's not scrolling really quickly, it's because they're like simultaneously on Pro Tools trying to do something, but then they also realize that you just ran out of room on your script. As an engineer, I try to be as seamless as possible when I'm scrolling through scripts. And then also you'll see that, you don't see the sample script. Is it, do you see it now? I just moved on to the second slide, but basically can no one see the sample script? Is that is that not visible? Oh, I think, weird. So some people can see it, some can't. Oh, that's really weird. Okay, well, that might be a technical thing. I'm sorry if it's not visible. Well, I guess, yeah, interesting. Well, it's just to get an idea of what it is. It's just a VO script, or an Excel script. Okay, well, here, yeah, I can point my camera really quick towards it. It's probably not visible very well, but basically it's just an Excel script that has a bunch of different columns in it, with the line, character name, file name. So yeah, well, sorry about that. Anyway, but the other point I was going to make was that, again, when you have a VO script, a lot of times it has not junk, but for the sake of VO, junk stuff that you don't need. So a lot of times you'll need to filter those things out, hide columns. And so as an engineer, it's really good to know how Excel works in general so that you're not fighting against it when you need to format it, because because Excel scripts don't always come, pretty or clean. Like they'll have they'll just, someone who has who doesn't have experience in VO will just send it off, and it might have what you need in it, and so you'll need to format it so it looks nice for both you and the actor. Another thing about VO scripts for engineers is that it's great for anticipating projection. Once you get enough experience in recording VO, even if it doesn't have an intensity specification, you can kind of start seeing lines and guess like, oh, this is going to be loud, this is going to be soft. And then you can, even before the actor says their line, you can get a good estimation of where your gain needs to be for a line. So I also want to go over the organization of a VO room and the roles. And then this is a very generalized picture of what a VO room looks like. Really, every VO room is different. I've had VO rooms that were, with the booth to the left of everyone or to the right of everyone, where everyone was sitting next to each other. So this is just a general picture. But I want to go over, for engineers, you should really know the peculiarities of each room, because every VO room is different. When I was working full time, it was nice to get really familiar with specific rooms and kind of know it like the back of my hand. And if, it sounded weird for some reason, I could be like, oh, this is why, or the actor needs to stand here instead of here. But every VO room, like in LA, has, different, air conditioning, different levels of isolation. It's surprising how many like professional VO rooms have a lot of leakage. Signal flow is different. Whether like it's actually set up so the actors have their own screen to see the script. So it's really important. Like, so when I go into a room for the first time, I tend to just go in, assess what's, all these things. And then if there's a tech support person on staff or a studio engineer on staff, I tend to ask them, about any problems, or if I hear something weird, or if I hear lights buzzing, I try to figure out like if there's any way to solve that. So going back to these roles, so I really want to briefly go over the roles of the different people in the room. If you're an actor or you've done engineering, you might have seen an assistant engineer, and their role is primarily to track takes, track the progress of the script, make sure the lines are accurate. And then also, and I worked as an assistant for a long time, so also just general duties like tracking the actor in and out times. I've made a lot of coffee in my day. And, so the thing about assistant engineers is I've noticed as a freelancer, fewer and fewer studios using them, which is, sessions can still function fine without an assistant engineer. Sometimes the director takes it upon themselves to track the progress in the script, keep an eye on the accuracy of lines, and then in terms of tracking take numbers in Pro Tools, the engineer tends to pull down the takes anyway into their session. So, so sometimes you can still edit a session efficiently or look at a Pro Tools session and know where all the selects, and the good lines are. I would still really argue that assistant engineers are important, because having someone whose job is specifically to make sure we get all the takes and make sure they're accurate, and they're not constantly multitasking on something else. I mean, granted, an assistant engineer is still multitasking, but making it that primary job to make sure a script is done completely and accurately, I feel like it overall does save time and money. I do some editing remotely, and I've received sessions back where I go through it and there are just lines missing. And I'll let I'll let the client know, like, hey, this wasn't recorded, and they'll be like, oh yeah, it wasn't. And and then you have to bring the actor back again. You have to schedule the studio again. So I really think, again, I know, assistant engineers, it is possible not to use them, but I would say that they can definitely save a session from missing lines and all that. So I still consider them an incredibly important role and worth it if a project has, the budget to hire them. We'll go over this more, obviously, because this talk is about VO recording, but engineers, they set up mic, handle client requests, manage the audio levels, they pull takes, they'll play back takes. And my last bullet point there about controlling the room, someone has a question. As a film student, it's pretty much mandatory to know Pro Tools. Does that count for game audio as well? So to answer the question in chat, yeah, for game audio, Pro Tools, at least for VO recording, Pro Tools is the go-to. I know some studios do use Reaper as well. I would say I've never used anything except for Pro Tools and Reaper. And Reaper, it's been very sparse. But there are some studios that use Reaper and have very specific reasons for using it. So yes, Pro Tools and Reaper. Anyway, my last bullet point here about controlling the room. This is kind of a more subjective, kind of vague bullet point, but as an engineer, you tend to be the person who knows the room the best in terms of the technical aspects, the equipment, the, just how everything works and how to make everything function. And so even though like you're not the client, you're not the director, you kind of have you sort of, in a way, set this sort of mood in terms of confidence, because if you know how the room works, you know, if they ask you, hey, let's roll, and you can roll right away, it kind of, that's what I mean by controlling the room. Like you sort of instill confidence in everyone that like, okay, the technical aspect is taken care of, we can do our jobs. So there is a sense of like just being confident and being proficient in what you do. That, you know, kind of, it's just a sense. I don't know if that was worth a bullet point, but there you go. Every session will, well, not every session, but sometimes the client will come and they tend to be a representative from the publisher, developer, etc. There could be one client, there could be 0 clients at the session. There could be, I think the most I've ever had for a session is 12, maybe even 14. And that was too much. I won't say who that was, but it was, but you could have, you know, the number tends to be 0 to 4, I would say, 90% of the time. In terms of what their actual role is for, you know, their company, often the clients will be a combination of writers, producers, sound designers. I've even been on a project where the composer was there, even though we weren't doing anything related to music. You know, we had the composer was still there for input. And they provide clarity regarding script context, you know, intention. They'll explain gameplay elements because, you know, sometimes, you know, every few years a game comes out that is kind of new and exciting and does really unique things. And so if you're reading something in the script and it says, you know, character does this, and you have no frame of reference based on any other game, what that could be, they'll explain that to you. So you sort of have context. Sometimes I'll get into this more when I talk about directors, but sometimes they have the final say on what the lines are. Usually it's like the client and the director sort of communicate with each other about like which lines are, you know, should be selected, just based on the client knowing the project really well and the director, you know, their experience with performance. So the director, again, I know there are a lot of actors in here, so you're well aware what a director does. But they guide the performance of the actor. They work with the client to interpret the script and select takes. You know, one really important thing that directors do, and I think is a sign of a really good and experienced director, is they'll pace the actor to avoid fatigue. You know, and they'll sometimes, you know, some directors have really good techniques for doing that. And I will also say, I didn't mention this in my bullet point, but I will also say that is, I think one of the main ways for a director to help an actor avoid fatigue, again, just from watching directors, because I'm not a director, but is communicating with the actor, because the actor, and communicating honestly with the actor. You know, if the actor is comfortable and the director makes it clear that, hey, be honest with me, let me know when your voice is going out, that goes a long way to avoiding fatigue, because, you know, you don't, you know, I feel like the best directors make actors feel comfortable with telling them when they need to stop. You know, an actor should not feel pressured to tear their throats apart. And luckily, I feel like most directors I work with don't pressure them to do that. And then also managing time. It's just, studio time is expensive and hiring people for overtime is expensive. So I think the director tends to be the one, I think, who manages the pacing and time of everything. And so just general comments regarding the roles. Like a lot of things in this webinar, I'm speaking very generally. These roles are very dependent on everyone's experience, expectations, relationships, and budget. I've worked, there's this one project, this MMO I've worked on, that's been going on for, I think, over a decade. And the same people have been working on it. And so, and the director who's on it, he just sometimes the client shows up. Actually, a lot of times the client shows up, but sometimes they need to do a pickup session and the client is busy, but the director's available. Like, the director will just do it themselves, and it's no big deal because they've been doing it for 10 years. They know, they get it. They know the context, even if they're getting the script for the first, a new script for the first time. So there's, so when you've worked on a project for a long time, there is a sort of trust, and not just between the client and the director, but between, the engineer and the client, the engineer and the director, that can sort of change, it can kind of blur the roles a bit. I will say that as an engineer, I try to be respectful of everyone's roles. Like, my job is very technical. I don't try to dabble in the creative sense, as in the sense that, if there's a line said, I'll comment on if it's technically good. Like, if it's like, oh, there's, there was noise in that, or, the actor, there was a pop or something in there. Like, I'll comment on that. But I don't comment on saying like, oh, that doesn't sound right for that scene. Like, because that's not my job. Unless someone specifically asks me, which sometimes they do, but usually they don't. And and I don't, that's not my job. But yeah, it might take a lot of sessions to establish a relationship, a workflow. And then, like I've mentioned before, the clients and the assistant engineer, like, those roles may or may not be present for some or all sessions. I have had one single session these 9 years where it was only the actor and the engineer, which was really weird because the actor just came in with the script, said their lines, and then they just kind of looked at us and asked if the lines were said okay, and we just kind of were like, I think, it was very weird. Usually there is at least a director there. Really quick, touching on microphones. These are not the only microphones used in VO, but I tend to see these most often. Obviously, with remote recording, it's sort of broadened in terms of what actors are willing to purchase for themselves. But I would say the Neumann U87 is the most common, and then sometimes the shotgun mics will be used for specific reasons. And then the DPAs that I listed in the bottom right corner, those are lavalier mics, and those tend to be used for when, like, let's say some of the dialogue there was some mocap recorded for motion capture recorded on a set. And usually when we do motion capture recording, we use these DPA mics. And so sometimes when we're recording lines in a studio for that project, we'll use those DPA mics so that we're consistent with the mics across the board. In what situations would you use a shotgun in a studio? It really depends on, it depends on what the client asks for. Because sometimes, and to be honest, like, I like the U87, one, because I feel it's easy to use. Second, like, I feel like you get more the low end, and you get that less with a shotgun. But sometimes the client just, either because they're used to using a shotgun or because they just like how it sounds for a specific character or for multiple characters, they'll request to use it. There was one project I was working on, specifically where they would use the U87 if someone had a deeper voice to get the low end. And then they were using, I believe it was the KM81 for just either if the person didn't have a deep voice or if it was a human. I forget specifically what the delineation was. But yeah, it's just because a shotgun will sound a little bit different. And so it's really based on client. I use the Sen at home because seems like is that normal for a mic? Yeah, I would say that. I would say that shotguns do pick up less noise from everywhere around. I guess, if you're in a studio that is well isolated, then that shouldn't be an issue. But I think that sort of speaks to, I think it is normal for a mic to pick up every tiny sound if it is there. But I think that speaks to this idea of it's all contextual. Like, it's all based on the actor's voice. It's based on the environment. It's based on the sound you're trying to get. And so, there isn't a single mic for any, that is perfect for every situation. But if you're really thinking about like what sounds best for my setup for my voice, that's what should influence your mic decision. Hopefully I answered those questions well, because there's a lot of discussion I think to be had about what mic works best for what situation. So when I try to mic people, I try to have the mic about 1 to 1.5 feet away, and not pictured here, but usually there's a pop filter between the mic and the actor. But the idea is, and I try to have it kind of angled, pointing to their chin. I try not to aim it at their nose. This just tends to be a nice area to get it at, so that so if the actor's moving up and down, you're still kind of getting, it's still mostly pointed towards their mouth area. Also, you're going to have to imagine that U87 in the picture is angled so that the diaphragm is actually parallel to the actor's face. But they're, if using a shotgun, would you point it toward the chest more or still toward the chin? I still tend to aim for the chin. I feel like if you aim it too much towards the chest, you tend to get less clarity. But the thing is, it's like, this is kind of my starting point. And then we start recording. And then if the director says, hey, like, I feel like we're losing some of the low end. I feel like we're losing some of the clarity. Like, is there anything you can do? Then I'll start adjusting the mic. This is just kind of my starting point. And it tends to work pretty well. It also has the added benefit of avoiding plosives, because if you have the mic just kind of straight on, like not angled, but right in front of the actor, I tend to get plosives more, even with a pop filter. So this starting setup is kind of nice to avoid that issue. But again, like the discussion with just what mic you choose, it's all contextual. I would say most sessions I do, I've stopped and said like, hey, let me readjust this mic, or, I wouldn't say half of the sessions because that, but I would say a lot of sessions I stop. Is there a way to fix plosives if the actor doesn't re-record the line? Yeah, so it's kind of beyond the scope of this, of just this webinar, but I will say that plosives are, in my opinion, easier to fix than a lot of people think. There's this, I don't know if you've seen Isotope. It's an editing software, but it lets you edit dialogue on a frequency basis. I think I do have a picture of it somewhere in these slides. But yeah, when I get a plosive, like I literally just open up Isotope, go at the, I look at the very low end of the frequency, and I'll see it and I just clean it up. So that's how I do it. I mean, Isotope is expensive. So, it's not like something you can download for $10 and be like, okay, I can fix all my plosives. That's why generally as an engineer, I still try to avoid plosives. One, because it makes it look like I'm working hard, and I am. But also because, if I'm editing something, if I know I'm the editor on a project, I tend to let things go a little bit more if I know I can fix it. But if I'm handing it off to someone else, like I don't know what software they have. So I guess to answer your question, yeah, it is possible. I try not to get too lazy with my engineering though, just because I know it's possible. But yeah, plosives are, as long as they're not egregious, they are, I would say most of the time they are fixable. Anyway, this is just going over all the points I just mentioned before. The only thing I didn't mention is that those DPA microphones, I tend to put them over the eye, above their head, so they're not angling. It's a different setup. So a quick note about preamps. You tend to, when I was working full time, I didn't get a lot of experience with different preamps. Like I tended to use, and I didn't label these, but I tended to use a Focusrite in the upper right hand corner, and every once in a while the one down the lower left corner. And I guess the thing I would say about preamps is that as long as they're professional grade preamps, like I'm sure there are differences in how they color the sound, but I've never walked in a studio and listened to a preamp and said this was unusable. I would say any professional grade preamp is still going to be most of the time useful for professional VO recording. What I will say is that if you're an engineer and you ever have a chance to use multiple preamps, take advantage of that, because I would say the best preamp is the one that you know how to use well. I mean, obviously, once you get used to a lot of preamps, you can kind of start having preferences. But for me, like as an engineer, if I know how preamps function, then I can run a session well. So, if I'm not struggling with a preamp, or I'm not like trying to be like, I have no idea what the gain's going to sound like at, 11 o'clock on this preamp versus another preamp. If I'm not struggling with that, and if I kind of also am familiar with all the features on a preamp, because if you look at the Avalon in the upper left-hand corner, like it has, I believe it has it has like a compressor in there and everything. And so knowing how all that functions is, I think, the most important thing to actually recording good audio, rather than the actual preamp itself, if that makes sense. Not saying that, $100 preamp that you got on Craigslist is equal to every other preamp, but I'm just saying that, like, to an engineer, the most important thing is that you know how to use the preamp, a specific preamp. So organizing a Pro Tools session. So it's really important to be really well organized with a Pro Tools session, because it helps you able to play back selects really quickly. And it also helps, when you record a VO session, like those files are going to change hands so many times. So it's really useful if the thing you're starting with is easy to read by everyone. And so this is just kind of what a VO session looks like. Again, this is very basic, single mic session. I'll have a record track, a select track, an alt track. I'll have controls for Skype or Zoom, talkback headphones, because I want to be able to control, if a client is on Skype listening, I want to be able to control how loud they can hear the actor, and also if the actor can even hear them themselves, because sometimes the client will want to talk to the actor. Same thing if a director's on Skype. And also I have a headphone control, so I can control how much the actor is hearing themselves. And then on the record track, I usually have a roll off, very light compression. And then you'll see in the lower right, I tend to have a monitoring tool, just to make sure that the actor's recording at an okay level. And I tend to try to get the actor, conversational dialogue I tend to have at -28 short-term LUFS. And also, just as a side note, sometimes, I mentioned this before, but some preamps have their own roll-off, their own compression. But I will say, the main point I would take away from stuff like roll-offs and compression is that roll-offs tend to be between 60 and 80 hertz. And compression, I tend to use very, very light compression. And I'm not going to touch too much on how compression works and what all the settings mean, but I tend to use very light, very unintrusive compression. But yeah, just other tips about organizing a session: make sure you understand other people's templates. If you walk into a studio, try to just get used to looking at other people's templates and understanding the signal flow to them. Be consistent with naming your tracks on a specifically within the same project, because again, it helps with organization. If you kind of have a standard naming convention, drop markers. Drop markers a lot so that any editor can understand, a session if they get it back. Like if there's something weird or you jumped around the script, it's good to drop a marker to say like, hey, we just jumped 60 lines down the script. So don't be surprised if, you get to the next line and you can't find it. And I also say don't record over material, which I'll try to explain that as best as I can. So this is what a session looks like. There are far more lines most of the time, but this is kind of what a finished session will look like. You'll see that it's recorded linearly down the line. And then imagine that the director called out all these takes. And so I just use the grabber tool in Pro Tools to pull them down. And then, same thing for the alts. And so then you have a really nice clean session where it's really easy to see, oh, here are all the selects. Like I'll just, I'll edit those. And it makes it really easy if for some reason the director asks me like, hey, can you just play back the last 50 selects so that we know they're consistent? Then I just tab, play, and it's super easy to do it that way. And when I say don't record over stuff, it's all digital. So you're technically not recording over something the way you would think of recording over like a, tape. But what I mean by that is if you look at in the record track, all these sections, I just record down the line. Like if the director says oh, I don't want anything from take 2, I'm not going to go back in front of take 2 and then start recording over that to even if they say that material is useless, because I don't know, there could be a syllable or a word in there that I need to grab when I'm editing to fix the actual select. Hopefully that makes sense, because telling someone not to record over something in Pro Tools technically doesn't make sense, because you can't actually, unless you delete a file, you're not recording over anything. But hopefully you understand what I mean. And then also just keep your sessions. Real estate on your screen is also really important. Sometimes I get sessions that look like this, where the engineer included if you look in the upper left-hand corner, the bars and beats, the feats and frames, the samples. the comment section, like they'll just include all this stuff. And sometimes it is necessary depending on what you're doing, but I would say I do my best to make my sessions look like this rather than this. Just because selfishly, like it's easier for me to like see things. And I also feel like it just is easier for an editor to like see things the second they open the session. These are the plugins I mentioned, the compression, the roll off. That's a bad roll off picture because I would not roll off 537 Hertz. It would be more like just 70 Hertz. And so I know I'm going a little bit over, but I'll still have time at the end for questions. So the way the workflow is that lines are read and analyzed by the director and the actor and the client. Lines are recorded, usually multiple times. There's some discussion about what we recorded, some playback, and then sometimes I'll edit and I'll try to edit our comp fixes. If you're an actor, you know what this is. Sometimes if you're recording a line, if you record a line multiple times and the director's like, oh, the first half of that line was great, but the second half of the other take was great. Can you put them together? Sometimes we do that to try to fix a line or try to, I wouldn't say fix the line, but, make the best performance possible. And if none of that works, we go back to step 2 or even step 1. If for some reason we realize the intention we thought the line wasn't correct, and then we move on. So that's just a very bare bones description of like kind of the workflow of a VO session. And while we're working, I'm almost always recording. The space isn't really an issue. In terms of like saving file sizes. Like I usually will, stay recording, especially if I'm like kind of multitasking so I don't miss what the actor says. If the actor and the director are kind of talking about their weekends, then I'll stop recording because I don't need to record that. But usually like I tend to err on the side of just staying in record. And that also keeps me from having to slate. I feel like in some other industries, they tend to slate more, especially with ADR and stuff like that. And so sometimes actors come in and ask me like, hey, do I need to slate or say something before every take? And they don't. And that just makes the session go faster. And I just tell the actor to trust me that they're being recorded when they start talking, and that usually works out. Like I said before, I try to anticipate gain adjustments. I listen for audio abnormalities, clicks, pops, scratchiness in the throat, just things that don't sound good. Then I pull takes and comps. I try to anticipate comps because sometimes I'll listen to the director and the client saying, they'll start talking about like how much they really like the first half of one line and the second half another line, but they haven't gotten to the point where they're actually telling me to comp that together. So even if they haven't told me, I'll try to like just do that on my own. If I just so that like they'll ask me and then I'll be like, yeah, sure. And I just do it right away. Or sometimes they'll see me doing it and then they'll just ask me to play it once they see me doing it. And then just troubleshoot any issues. I try to troubleshoot as stealthily as I can, again, to kind of instill confidence. But it also pays to be honest. And if there's really an issue in the studio that does need time, it pays to be honest and tell them like, hey, I need 5 minutes to take care of this. Again, it goes a long way if you actually have a relationship with, the client and the director so that they know like, okay, there's an issue, but you're going to handle it. I kind of already went over this. Just be respectful of each other's roles. Acknowledge that everyone has differing levels of technical prowess. And then remember you're a team and everyone in the room is aiming for the same goal. So, as an engineer, I get caught up a lot in the technical aspect of VO engineering, and I tend to get now I'm pretty soft spoken as a person, so I don't really let my frustration show. But sometimes I get frustrated because I'm like, there things are going on in the room, or like, and I'm like this, they're not being considerate of like the technical aspect, or they're, but then I have to remind myself like, there's more to VO than it sounding clean. I mean, obviously I want the audio to sound good and clean, but at the end of the day, like the performance, is matters so much. And so like, if the actor is moving around a lot because they're really trying to get into the role and they're going off mic, like, I have to remind myself like, okay, I'm not fighting the actor to get them to stay still. We're working together to figure out how they can get into the role while still providing like a good, clean audio take for me. So it's just like, it's a team effort. You need good performance to elicit an emotional response in your audience. But at the same time, you need the performance to be technically sound so that nothing's lost and the performance has a chance to shine. So really briefly, going to touch on remote work because of COVID. So I will say that there is a lot you can accomplish as an engineer. And I know, and I think actors actually kind of have it a little harder because I know actors have had to buy, purchase a lot of equipment that they might not have had already. They've had to, treat their rooms, or actually like find rooms that are, in their apartments or their houses that they can actually use. So, I think it's been a bit more of a struggle and a bit more of a time and money investment for them. But for an engineer, it's actually, there's a lot I can do with just I literally run sessions and edit on a 2012 MacBook Pro. And, as an engineer, like I found that I just need to figure out a way to get audio into Pro Tools, a way to play back to everyone, a way to talk to everyone and to mute myself. And then I'll go over syncing audio a bit later. But, so it's actually easier than you might think to record at home. And so we've been using various methods. We've been using Skype, Zoom, Source Connect Standard and Source Connect Now. Source Connect Now is like the web app version of Source Connect. It's not quite as good, but it still sounds good, and it's a free web app, so it's convenient because everyone can use it. But kind of what we've been doing is like we've been having the actors record themselves locally and then send us the files after. And this is mandatory if you're using Skype and Zoom because the audio quality is just nowhere near good enough to use in a professional product. With Source Connect's Standard and Source Connect Now, you could probably get away with, I actually have gotten away with just using the audio from those. I will say the difference between, I will say I prefer to use Source Connect Standard or Source Connect Now and still have the actor record themselves raw versus using Zoom and Skype and getting the files back. Because even if I'm getting the files back from the actor, like even if it's like kind of at the end of the day, I'm still using the same files for editing and delivering to the client, I just can't hear certain things about I can't pick up technical things on Zoom and Skype as well as I can with Source Connect. So I prefer not to use those just for monitoring purposes. And sometimes it's necessary to use Zoom and Skype. I'm not saying that you should, refuse to use those things. But I will say that if you're using Zoom and Skype to monitor the actor, I just, you just have to be a lot more vigilant and a little more conservative about judging their performance. You know, if an actor says a line really loud, you do kind of have to either tell that, like, just get a backup, even if you're not sure if it clipped or not. So that's what I'll say on that. And then with the remote work, communication is there a bias if you have to use the DAW other than Pro Tools, Logic, or Studio One? Actually, I'll let me answer that. I'll get to that actually really quick. I think it's in my next slide. So I will say that before I get to that, I'll say that communication is really key for remote recording. Just communicate as much as you can before the session. You know, whatever's appropriate. I mean, obviously as an engineer, if help is hiring me to work with a client, you know, and if I have questions, I try to go through help before I go through, you know, like I'm not going to email the client directly. But, you know, just communicate as much as you can. And that includes running tests before the session. You know, ask and see, you know, whoever's your point of contact, ask them like, hey, is it possible for me to like test, like, does the actor have time to like test before we actually start the session? So I know that, you know, one, they know how to record and deliver files. And so that I can actually get familiar with the DAW that they're working with. Because even things like exporting files, like every DAW is different. Like it just, there's no standard, like, you know, like, oh, I click here, then I click here, then I click here. Like it's different for everyone. It's also good to assess how the actor's room sounds to make sure that it's not too reverberate. You know, and then you also have to just make sure the actor knows how to use their equipment, research mics and other equipment. And also the bullet point about knowing when to talk, that's actually for during the session. Just know when to speak and when to kind of stay more quiet during a session, because it's really easy when everyone's remote to talk over each other. So it's kind of a skill to sort of know when to let someone have the floor, even when you need to speak up and say like, hey, I need to know information. Like again, that all goes back to relationships, your rhythm, your workflow. So considering a bias, if an actor uses the DAW other than Pro Tools. So in my opinion, with remote work, it doesn't matter. I don't think it matters what DAW to use as long as it can record to the spec the client needs. So for example, at the bottom there, I crossed out GarageBand because GarageBand only records, I only discovered this through remote recording because I never had to consider it, but GarageBand only records up to 44.1 kilohertz. And the minimum spec for, I would say 99% of clients, probably 100% of clients, to be honest, is 48 kHz and 24-bit. So what I would say about using a DAW other than Pro Tools like Logic or Studio One, as long as it can record and export at the correct spec, in my opinion, it's fine. And as an engineer, I've sort of discovered that it's up to me to be familiar with those DAWs, because, you know, sometimes the actor will want to, will need to troubleshoot something. And so it is kind of my responsibility. And I listed like Twisted Wave. I've seen people use Audacity. I've seen people use Reaper. I've actually not really seen anyone using remote recording, but like I mentioned, like someone was asking a while back, it is used sometimes by clients, or requested by clients. So yeah, my advice to engineers is get somewhat familiar with as many DAWs as possible, especially things like Audacity and Twisted Wave, which I believe are free. So you can kind of play around with them without investing any money. And for actors, I would say, whichever DAW you use, just be used to it. With the caveat that I've yet to meet a client that is very specific about DAWs, but I wouldn't guarantee that a client wouldn't say like, oh, they're not using Pro Tools. Like, don't let them use that. In my opinion, it doesn't matter as long as it's the right spec. But just the caveat that I'm not a client, so I'm not going to guarantee that you'll never run into anyone who has a bias against other DAWs. But personally, like if I were in charge, I would just care about if you can record to spec and export correctly. That's all I care about. And then, I usually have and so getting back to sort of the workflow for remote work. So I mentioned getting the files back from the actor, the raw files. And usually, so even if I'm monitoring them over Skype, I still record the Skype feed. And then at the end, I'll take that Skype feed, or I'll have the Skype feed. I'll take the actor's local audio, and then I'll sync it up in the Pro Tools session so that all the markers I drop, it lines up so that, and then like all the takes I might have pulled, those line up as well on the timeline. This is why usually when I do remote work, I try to have the actors record long takes and to record as few takes as possible, within reason. Like I don't want to record 2 hours, a 2-hour long take just in case the actor's computer suddenly shuts down and we lose all that material. But I try to have actors record long takes because that's fewer takes I have to sync up later. I know I've met some actors who, when they send me something back, they'll try to chop things up as much as possible to remove dead space, because I think it's helpful to me because it's like, oh, I'm taking out all the dead space. It's only my takes. And that's really appreciated because I know they're thinking of me. But I mean, I honestly prefer, like, even if the director and the actor are talking about their weekend for 10 minutes, like I'm still fine with including all that because it just means I have to sync less later. And I'm never, an editor's never going to even look at that dead space. They're only going to see what I've pulled down, and it's easier to pull things down if everything's in sync. So that's just kind of how I've been sort of rolling with remote work and trying to make sure it takes as less time as possible at the end to sync things. So yeah, useful software. Source Nexus, that is, if you're interested in remote recording as an engineer, I don't think actors need to use this, but Source Nexus, I know engineers have been using it for routing, to kind of replace, the more intricate routing that in-person, like these studios have set up before, COVID. Keyboard Maestro and Trackball Works, those are just ways to work faster. Keyboard Maestro is a macro program that lets you kind of, I wouldn't call it programming, but they try to set up, you can set up like a sequence of keystrokes that help you when recording. Trackball Works, you can set shortcuts to certain buttons. I've met engineers who don't set their buttons to shortcuts at all. Which is fine, but to me, like having 2 free shortcuts at the tip of my fingers is useful for me, engineering quickly. And then the bottom right, I mentioned Isotope RX. That's kind of what the editor looks like when you're looking at a frequency perspective. If there were a P-pop, if we were talking about P-pops, if there was a P-pop in here, which there doesn't look like it is, but if there were, you would see like a kind of a bright yellow spot towards the very bottom. And then there are tools you can use to just like almost like just scrub that out. And then it's great because you're only scrubbing out the low frequency part of it. You're not like actually chopping off the whole like little, millisecond or fraction of a second. So I believe if you're interested in Isotope, it's expensive, but they do have a free, I think they do a free 30-day trial, like full featured. So it's actually really, and they have a lot of tutorials. So if you're ever interested in like just how well you can edit stuff, there's a lot of resources to know without actually having to drop money on this. Also, this is an incomplete list. There's a bunch of other pieces of software out there, some that I don't know about, but I've heard other people using. So there's more out there. Useful skills and advice, tolerance for repetition. It's useful, I guess, both for actors and engineers if you're okay with just sometimes repetitive sessions. I've had sessions where every character that was brought in was unique, and I was, the entire day, like my jaw hurt from laughing so much. And then I've had sessions where we would bring in 4 actors a day, and they literally had the same exact script. And then I think I've even had a week where it was that, where we would bring in like 2 to 4 actors a day. They all had the exact same script. And so by Friday, it's like, hearing the same 100 lines over and over, it was a little grating. So it does help to know that sometimes these sessions can get really repetitive. It's helpful if you enjoy the acting process, even if you're not an actor, because a lot of engineering is kind of sitting there and listening to the actor and the director kind of craft a performance, which can be really interesting. And so to some people it's not. I've met some people like that, but for some people it is. So it's helpful, again, in terms of, especially helps you to tolerate the repetition. It's good if you're naturally curious and you're good at troubleshooting. That's more of a technical thing, but like if you're engineering a session and the thought in your mind pops up, it's like, how can I do this faster? Or how can I do this better? Or sometimes when I'm recording something, sometimes something won't sound very good. And so we'll do a pickup, and then we'll get a nice clean take and then we'll move on. But in my brain, I'm thinking like, I wonder if I could have fixed that take and made it work. And then so after the session, I'll drop a marker just for myself. And after the session, I'll pull, the quote unquote bad take. And I'll just see like, can I fix this? So it's just good to be naturally curious and to be someone who likes to solve problems. I think it makes you a better engineer. Don't be afraid to socialize. This is me being hypocritical because I'm actually a very quiet person. But it does help, when you're in a room with people to like, and I there are probably some of you here who have no trouble with this, but it's good for building a relationship to like just talk, like just during breaks, talk to people. It doesn't have to be about the project, but just get to know who you're working with and to let them know that you're not just, as an engineer, you're not just there to have your back to them for 4 hours. Same thing with actors. I found it really does build camaraderie and over, a period of time can really help make sessions better. Be good at dialogue editing, even if you just only want to engineer, because like we were talking about with the P-pops, it's good to know if something can be edited, because then like if you record a take, it can be fixed and the director tells you like, hey, was that okay? You can tell them like, yeah. And then you move on, you save time by not having to re-record it. And, the end result is just as good as if you had, recorded a pickup. I could do an entire hour presentation about this last point, but I really do believe it's important to play, watch, know about video games. I feel like this is one of the few industries where I meet a lot of people who, where it's a industry, it's a game industry, but I do meet a lot of people who say they don't really have anything to do with games in their personal life, which is understandable because with video games, compared to like TVs and films, games are interactive, which means there is an accessibility barrier um, for some people. What I will say though is that I think there's a misconception that that most games are like Call of Duty, where you have to be like really on the ball, really fast. You're playing, you're going to be playing against these 12-year-olds who are streaming on Twitch for 10 hours a day. But I think the misconception is that, or the thing that people don't realize, is that there are a lot of games out there of different genres that are easier or don't require you to have like fast reflexes or to like have to, there are some games that have like zero challenge in them. And even if you don't want to play those games, people post stuff on YouTube all the time. There are articles about games that you could read. And I really think that there is a language to video games that I actually really do see. I really do see a difference within directors and actors who I know play video games. I know that they tend to get certain concepts faster. Now, that is to say, I do know some of the best VO talent out there who have told me that they don't play games at all. And that's fine. Like they're still like amazing and really good. But in my opinion, though, I do see it help in some, and this isn't every session. Like, like there are some sessions where, I've worked with the director who I know plays video games a lot, and, their ability to play games never comes up. But I have been in sessions where like we've saved time because we looked at a piece of dialogue, we saw the description of what was going on, and it wouldn't make sense to someone who wasn't familiar with, that genre of game. But then the director was like, oh yeah, I know this genre. Like I know that this specific term means this. Even if the client's on the line to explain it, like then it still saves time. Same thing with actors. I've seen actors who pick up on things really quickly because they sort of know the language of games. So, I mean, I think, again, games are interactive. So there is, and some games require a lot of your time. But I do think even if it's for like 10 minutes a month and you want to just pull up a YouTube video and just look at gameplay footage to see like, oh, this is what games look like what they're like right now. I think it's helpful. I've ranted about this to friends. I'll answer your question in a second. Is that the only other question? Yeah. I'm almost done, so I'll answer this question at the end. So anyway, there's a lot more I haven't covered in this talk, despite the fact I've gone way over than I think the time was supposed to be. There are other topics like mocap recording, recording a time code, multi-mic recordings. So there's way more to talk about. There's just kind of as brief as I can make it, overview. But just to let you know that there's just far more to this topic than we'll be covering right now. But yeah, so I have time to answer questions. Let's see. Do you maybe have some advice, tips for rookie sound designers that want to get some work in the gaming industry? Would you recommend to focus on stuff like internships or just build a portfolio on your own? How did you get into the industry and get work on so many projects? So I will say, so the answer to that question is both a portfolio and internships. I would say if I had to, I've never been in a hiring position, so I don't speak with that authority, but I will say, if you had to choose one over the other, portfolio versus internships, I would say internships, just because I've learned so much from interning. And I think connections matter more than a portfolio. That said, portfolios are really helpful because sometimes portfolios are your kind of way to get those connections. I'm trying to think if I have any other advice. I mean, internships are just really important because I personally have not gotten a job directly through an internship, but I have seen people who have. and and I had the way I got into the industry was Chip and Julia, the founders of Halp, they hired me back in 2011, the autumn of 2011. The story of that was that there was this game called Connect Disneyland Adventure. And they apparently were running just like 3 to 4 different stages at once. Like they were recording this project at multiple different studios. And so they needed assistance on, to take notes and things like that. And so they, Julia, I went to Loyola Marymount for recording engineer, and I studied recording engineering. And so Julia, who also went to that same school, contacted one of my professors. My professor recommended a few people. I sent in my resume, and on my resume, I had done 3 internships. So I never asked Julia what specifically made her and Chip bring me in, but that could have been the reason. But yeah, they brought me in for, I was expecting to go in for a 30-minute interview. I ended up staying the whole day to observe, which meant that the interview went well. And then within the next few days, I was on a session taking notes. So that was sort of my route. I just did the work in doing internships so I could have a nice resume. I did well in school. I think there is a larger conversation about whether you actually need to go to school for sound design. It just happens to be what I did and just happened to work out for me in terms of, getting my foot in the door. And then the reason I got to work on so many projects is because I didn't mess up enough to the point where they would stop bringing me in. I think Chip and Julie would say I overall did a good job, but yeah, they just kept asking me to come back in, and I kept saying yes. So that is kind of how I've and then I've built relationships with, other people through that. Being an assistant is actually really, I've never worked for a developer. I've only worked for third-party facilities, which is nice in a lot of ways because you do meet clients from a lot of different developers. You meet a lot of different directors. And so you're kind of meeting a greater variety of people than you would if you were working only with a single group of people. So I hope that answered your question. At home, I have to turn the gain down for efforts and other loud lines, but then it sounds so far away, it doesn't match the rest of the dialogue. What am I doing wrong? Trying to think. For efforts and other loud lines, it's hard to say without hearing it. As long as you're, I know some actors might step away from the mic in addition to gain it down, and it should, as long as you're not stepping away from the mic too much, it should still be okay. Sometimes I think I know what you're talking about. Like you listen to it back and then you're like, yeah, this doesn't match. I will say that most projects do go through a mastering process where we're kind of adding another layer of compression. We're gaining it up so that it matches a certain spec. So sometimes, like, even if something, like, right after you record it, you hear it and it's like, yeah, it doesn't sound good. A lot of times it's still going to go through a mastering process. I guess that doesn't really answer. I don't know if that addresses your concern. If a client, I guess I would say if a client has said something to you about it, yeah, I guess it's hard for me to say. It's hard for me to say without hearing it, but part of me thinks that it can be mastered so it sounds okay. So I think you're okay. But I don't say that with the authority of someone who's actually heard your audio. Yeah, as an engineer, I can change it in post so it does match, but isn't distorted. Yeah, that's part of the mastering process. Um, let's see. Someone else had a question. Since the game industry, do you also experience crunch, or is that more for developers? Um, so yeah, so like I said before, I've never worked at a development studio. A lot of my colleagues who are kind of my mentors, um, they ended up going other places. And like so one of my friends who was kind of my first mentor, he I think he works as a narrative designer now in Sweden for a developer. Another one of my, I don't know if they would want me calling them mentors, but they taught me a lot. And another one of my mentors is a recordist at another developer, both super talented people. But yeah, to actually answer your question instead of reminiscing, um, I haven't experienced crunch. I mean, I've definitely had. What I will say is that if you work in games, even at a third-party studio, not third-party, what at a at just another studio like I have, um, you do still experience difficulties you wouldn't experience with like a 9 to 5 job. Um, like I've had 12-hour days before. I've had days where, my friends want to meet up for dinner or something, like, yeah, let's meet at 6. And I tell them like, oh, like, yeah, I might be off at 5, or I might be off at 7 or 8. I've definitely had those experiences. So there's definitely a certain unpredictability to your work schedule if you're working in games. I imagine that's the same for a lot of other creative industries too, but specifically for games, yeah. But I would not call it crunch, because a lot of what you hear about crunch is, you often hear horror stories about like it going on for months, like 12-hour days for 3 months in a row. And, for me, like I might have, like a week of long days, maybe 2 weeks. But I would not call it crunch, but I would definitely call it it still has its own difficulties. Yeah, it still has its own difficulties. So, yeah, hopefully that answers the question. I also kind of don't want to speak for everyone when it comes to what they consider crunch, because I know it's sort of a sensitive topic, and I don't want to, if someone who's worked at a third party studio like I have, and they feel like they're under crunch, I don't want to devalue their words, or I don't want to make light of the struggles they're going through with their schedule. I would just say, personally though, like personally, when I go into a VO session, I'm less tired than my clients. Maybe that's the better way to put it. As a freelance engineer, are you more of an operator with studio tech backing you, or do you make workflow decisions and technical suggestions? So that varies a lot. So where I used to work, it was, a head engineer and then 2 assistant engineers. And we were kind of our own tech support, which at least I later learned was kind of not the way a lot of other studios do it. Like I've had experiences where I've been in a studio, and then, I'm trying to connect with a client over Skype, and suddenly, like, for some reason, Skype isn't working. Maybe someone didn't update or something. And, and then I'm trying to figure out Skype. And then I've had experiences where I'd go over to another, studio as an assistant, and, I meet the engineer, and then it's like, and I tell them like, oh, by the way, for this session, we're using Skype. And then they literally just pick up the phone, and they're like, hey, they call their tech support and be like, hey, can you set up Skype for me? And then I think there was a period of time around the time I left my old full-time job, they kind of started integrating tech support. They started giving us a little bit more tech support, as opposed to us doing it all ourselves. and I'm not sure if the whole doing it ourselves was like kind of a personal decision amongst us, or whether it was actually because there wasn't budget for tech support. So I would say it's more common for an engineer to have someone who knows the studio. Like, I should say, I think it's a little bit more common for the person who knows how everything works, how the machine room works, how to set up, video recordings. There's a lot of things we didn't touch upon in the webinar that are more complicated than just like a single mic recording. But I think it's more common for that to be a separate role from the actual engineer. But I also don't be surprised if, as an engineer, that also becomes your job. It just depends on, how a place is staffed. Let's see. Oh, and as a freelance engineer, I missed the freelance engineer part of your question. I mean, as a freelance engineer, I tend to have, yeah, I talk so much about my full-time job. As a freelance engineer, I tend to have tech support. I try not to rely on them too much, but I do tend to have tech support. So that answers your question a little more succinctly. And yeah, sometimes I make technical suggestions though. Like sometimes a studio head will ask me like, hey, is there any way we can improve our workflow? And sometimes I will have input on that. So, but it's also because like one place I work at freelance, the studio head and I have worked a lot together, and he, trusts my opinion on things. So he'll ask me questions. And then when hired to do video recording, is it expected to know how to record SFX or music as well? I would say not really, not for the most part. I would say there was one time where, and I ended up not having to do this, and I think if I had, I would have been kind of screwed. But there was one time, there are very rare situations where we were doing a game and the client was like, okay, we want this next session to be, they're actually gonna, like, the actor's gonna sing over a song, or, they're gonna like sing in this, which is a whole other thing. And I don't really know how to record music. Like, I don't know much about like recording to tempo or, click tracks, things like that. So, so luckily, our head engineer at the time, who was awesome and kind of knows how to do everything, he just did the session and he knew how to do it, because he knew he knows everything. He probably would say that's not true, but he was able to do it. So to answer your question, like, no, not really. Like, it's good to know those things, but very rarely have I had to deal with SFX or music. Yeah. Anyone else have any other questions? Anything you wanted me to clarify? Any more? Oh, you're welcome, Rebecca. I think we worked together before, so it's good to see you. Is video recording for motion capture similar to film production sound recording? So there are some differences, I would say. I've done both things. So I'm trying to think of, I guess the problem I'm having is that there are a lot of differences. So I don't know where to begin. So I will say the nice thing, motion capture versus film, and I mean, I guess you're also implying that the motion capture is not, because motion capture can be both for games and film. But when it comes to doing motion capture for games versus maybe location recording for film, I'm assuming is what you mean. Yeah, it's different. I think it's nicer. You're not. Oh, I need to wrap it up. Sorry. So yeah, I'll just say it's different. It's a different process. There's less there's less concern about ambient sound, but yeah, sorry, it's looking like we need to wrap it up. So yeah, thank you everyone for attending. We may do a more in-depth class about this sometime in the future, maybe next year. It's something we've been talking with help about. But yeah, yeah, thank you everyone. I hope you learned a lot, and I'm sure I'll run into many of you in the future. So thank you.